with dictator Putin about whether it's all over. Is Kupiansk theirs or not? So what do you have to say about this right now? And yesterday we saw that the general staff of the Ukrainian armed forces denied this, but still, what is known at this hour?
Moreover, not only did they deny it, but apparently, impressed by the successes of the Ukrainian defense forces in the Kupiansk direction, the so-called chief of the general staff of the Russian Federation, Gerasimov, probably due to some age-related issues, confused the Russian army with the Ukrainian one, and that's why he reported only on the successes of the Ukrainian army in the Kupiansk direction to Putin. He, no less impressed, spoke about blocking 15 Ukrainian battalions in an area of about 4 square kilometers. We perfectly understand that it is physically impossible to deploy that many troops in such a space. Nevertheless, we all understand perfectly well that the dictator is also already of quite an advanced age, yet he still tries to live to 150, as he claims. Accordingly, of course, we are saying that the situation remains difficult as of today. So far, we have not yet managed to push the enemy beyond the boundaries of Kupiansk itself. However, the counter-attacking actions that the defense forces are demonstrating today are a gradual advance. These are not any sudden counter-offensive operations, but specifically counter-attacking actions. Nevertheless, they are resulting in our defense forces being able to reclaim certain tactical positions that were lost there several weeks or even months ago, specifically within the city of Kupiansk itself. The enemy is still on the outskirts of the city. The enemy has set up some logistics there. However, this logistics chain is complicated because our defense forces are not only working to clear certain locations in the city, but are also doing everything possible to disrupt the enemy's logistics. That's why the fighting continues. It is intense and fierce. However, I hope that the plans our brave soldiers and command are carrying out today will be fully realized. Then accordingly, we will somewhat improve the situation so that without raising unrealistic expectations, we can make progress on the Kupiansk front. Well, accordingly, reports in Moscow will most likely continue to sound the same way as has been the case for some time, with two aging war criminals indulging each other with information that doesn't correspond to reality. As they say, we have to do our own job. As for Gerasimov and Putin, they should be thinking about where and when they will be put on trial.
Sergey, what can I say? It's Gerasimov himself who spreads fake news, and then the propaganda channels follow suit, especially regarding the southern directions. But let's talk about what's actually happening in Donbas. The Russian army has lost more than 13,000 soldiers as a result of the counter-offensive actions of the armed forces of Ukraine in Donbas from August to October of this year. This was reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, during his speech at the meeting of the European Military Committee. Let's listen to his direct speech and discuss the details.
The operational and strategic situation remains difficult. The enemy continues to strike Ukrainian settlements and energy infrastructure facilities and is intensifying offensive actions along the line of contact. Since the beginning of the large-scale invasion, Russian terrorists have launched more than 112,000 Shahed-type attack drones, whose main targets have been residential buildings and civilian infrastructure, resulting in the deaths of children and civilians. Oleksandr Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, on Telegram.
Of course, the situation there remains quite tense, and that is why we devote a lot of attention to it in our broadcasts every day. What is happening there now, according to your information? Let's talk about this.
Well, in fact, if we talk about the Pokrovsk direction as the key one about the movement, the offensive movement of the Russian Federation, let me remind you that the Russians have concentrated here according to various estimates, but in particular, they mentioned that about 150 to 160,000 troops are grouped specifically in the Pokrovsk direction. This is accurate. Today, in order to maintain the intensity of combat operations, the Russians are trying to replenish these particular units of several combined arms armies as much as possible. I emphasize armies which are opposed by our brigades, replenishing them with manpower, because manpower is currently the key factor for the Russians that allows them to carry out assaults and conduct offensive actions with the highest possible intensity, which does not decrease. There may be certain moments when this intensity drops. This is primarily connected to the work, the combat operations of the defense forces, and accordingly it's also due to the regrouping of Russian troops. Because, as I already mentioned, the losses the enemy is suffering, and this was stated by Commander-in-Chief General Syrsky, are indeed significant. Therefore, it is necessary to replenish these units of the Russian army accordingly. But Pokrovsk serves another function as well, in my opinion. Today, through defensive actions and counterattacks as well, it is holding back a large enemy grouping. It is probably the largest among the Russian occupation forces today. This is so that these reserves from Pokrovsk, for example, are not redeployed to the same Huliaipol in particular. And when we talk about Pokrovsk, we also talk about Mirnohrad, although we fully understand that the fighting here remains extremely fierce. The enemy, having entered through the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk, has already established a certain foothold there. This foothold is already being supplied logistically, and as a result, the gray zone is very large, probably most of the city today. Although the lines on the northern outskirts of the city in the northern part of Pokrovsk are still being held today, particularly by our paratroopers, because this is the area of responsibility, let me remind you, of the 7th Air Assault Corps. Honor and praise to our titans, because in such battles the paratroopers have shown themselves in the best possible way. And, in fact, one of the nuances of these battles, which are ongoing in Pokrovsk, the enemy continues to attempt infiltration. Their tactics remain unchanged to build up their forces. They can stay there for several days, hiding. Literally, Russian soldiers hide in burrows there in order to continue, after gathering their strength, their offensive actions. So the intense and ongoing firefights continue. This so-called close combat, in which today highly trained and experienced Ukrainian paratroopers are once again demonstrating their remarkable skill, expertise, and professionalism in these dangerous and chaotic gun battles. It is becoming increasingly clear that Ukraine is steadily gaining the upper hand in this conflict, because Russian losses, which are mounting rapidly, far exceed, unfortunately, the losses that we are also suffering on our side. We are talking about our fallen, we are talking about our wounded. That is why evacuation exists, which is very difficult today, just like our logistics, because the Russians, accordingly, we strike at their logistics, and they strike at ours, and they are trying to break through to the area of the settlement of Raishain. I want to remind you that this settlement is currently probably the main logistical artery for our troops. Although for several weeks now there have been other alternative routes that supply our troops both in Pokrovsk and in Mirnohrad. By the way, to the north of Pokrovsk today, our troops are conducting counterattacks that are helping the Mirnohrad garrison, and accordingly we are expanding the areas under our control.
And drones continue to attack cities temporarily occupied by Russia, including Crimea itself. Sounds of explosions were heard in Simferopol, Armyansk, and Fardiske. According to reports from local social media groups, an electrical substation in Krasnoperkopsk may have been hit. This facility is a key node in the energy system of the Crimean Peninsula, one of its main transmission hubs. And it was also restless last night in Russia. The sounds of drones flying overhead and explosions were heard in Syzran, Samara region, and on social media, local residents reported about a dozen explosions. The results are still unknown, although perhaps you already know something. And how important are these strikes on Crimea as well? Is it also possible to cut it off from electricity, just as the Russian occupation forces are now trying to disrupt the energy system?
As for Syzran, I'll answer right away. The explosions occurred in the area of the oil refinery. This is not the first attack by our combat mosquitoes on this location. I hope, first of all, that there will be official confirmation. As for how successful this final shot was, I'm sure further reconnaissance is still ongoing, obviously, even at this very moment. By whom and with what, obviously, we are not discussing that. Nevertheless, I think the results will be negative for the Russians. Once again, it's 0 for the refinery, and that's what I'm hoping for. As for temporarily occupied Crimea and our Crimean front in general, I think it's safe to say that the Crimean front is not just open, it's very active and in real time with tangible consequences for the enemy. Because for now, our troops are not yet in Crimea. Nevertheless, the physical presence of firepower there is something the Crimeans, who aren't really Crimeans, feel literally every day and every night. Indeed, we're talking about the Krasnoperkopsk hub substation. It's even better known as the Soda substation because one of the vitally important industrial infrastructure plants for the Russian occupiers is located there, producing, among other things, bromine. And this, let's say, is a major, significant source of revenue for the Russian budget in Crimea. Accordingly, this is, let's say, one of the key elements of the global soda and bromine market. That's why I think such results will be positive for us. As for the substation, indeed, there were strikes. That's already obvious. And today we are indeed talking about the fact that such key substations are, steps towards shutting down critical Russian infrastructure. Today, we're not talking about civilians because these are strictly military facilities that support Russian logistics. The Russians themselves, through one of the Putins, declared that Crimea is an unsinkable aircraft carrier. But if you can't sink an aircraft carrier, although that's debatable, let's remember the Moskva, then at the very least you can cut off its electricity. You can see that Ukraine's defense forces are carrying out this kind of work. I'm not even mentioning the fact that every day military targets are being hit there. In particular, yesterday, the main intelligence directorate once again submitted its report. So the Crimean front is truly alive, it's active, and I would even say probably that it has excellent results.
Sergey, thank you so much for finding the time